Welcome to the Podcast Editor Mastermind Show. I am Steve. Hey, I got my haircut, Stuart, and with me, of course, is my co-host and co-founder of the Podcast Editor Academy, Mark Deal. Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Hey, everyone. I may or may not have a haircut underneath this hat, so no one wants to see it.
Remember the good old days when we first met and everybody thought that you were, what's his face?
Tim Ferriss?
Tim Ferriss. Yeah,
I shaved my head shortly after that, and that was well over a decade ago. I wasn't even 40 yet, and all right, I got to differentiate myself from him. And then Tim ended up shaving his head too, so there we were.
He was following the trend that you were setting.
I guess so, yeah. That's it.
With us today is the Seth Silvers. He is the founder and lead strategist over at Story On Media, a podcast strategy and production agency working to help businesses launch and grow podcasts. His team has worked with some of the leading podcasts, such as Alex Hormozi. I think a lot of people may recognize that name, and other creators in the country, along with helping launch successful podcasts in the micro niche business industries. I like that. And you can find more about him at storyon.co. Seth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Really happy to be here. I know any time I've gotten to talk with you guys, it's always been wonderful. So it's great to do this now with the record button behind us.
Yeah, usually the only time I get to talk to you is either A, when you're at a conference and I get about a minute there, or B, when we're on these other calls, these Zoom calls in a group that we're in. You're a busy man, and I can see why. You've got a lot of great shows that Story On works with. How many different shows are you guys actively working on?
Yeah, so usually it's kind of around 20. It's probably between like 16 to 20 shows. So on a for editors, this might be helpful, but like we've kind of shifted our thinking of it from like how many shows are we in total working with, and from a production standpoint, we're kind of tracking like episodes per week. So usually we're in the like 13 to 18 episodes per week. By the end of the year, that'll be closer to like 20, 30. Some of the shows are like kind of bi-weekly. Some of them are weekly. So, I mean, I'm sure you guys know there's kind of like a split. Some of them are multiple times a week. But from a project management standpoint, it's like we kind of need that. That's the important number from us internally, is how many episodes are we doing per week, and are we staffing that correctly? And then the other thing I'll say with that is we're starting to do more consulting where we're not doing any production, but we're just getting hired to kind of come in and work with a production team or a business that they're doing production in-house, but they're spinning their wheels with their podcast, but they don't know where they're going. So that number is kind of in flux, and we're figuring that out. It's fluid right now as far as how many shows are we doing production on, how many shows are we doing consulting on. But yeah, that kind of gives some perspective.
It brings up an interesting question, because I have heard of other podcast service business models much like that. They've got the weekly clients, a bi-weekly, monthly, and then there's some other ones in there as well. And it turns out that their efficiency Pareto thing is maybe around the bi-weekly shows, because it's not like they charge a little bit more than half than the people that are doing weekly. But that leads to a good question. And since you brought this up about planning the production flow, let's say you used a number, we'll use your round number of 20. Let's say all 20 of those, for example, not saying this is the case, but let's say all 20 of those are bi-weekly, so they're doing every 2 weeks. Is there anything that you do to try to get them on like 10 one week and 10 the other, and then vice versa? Do you motivate them, or just say, hey, this is what we have available? How does that work? I'm always curious about that.
Yeah, so we haven't had enough doing bi-weekly to really make sense for where we need to like kind of like guide them into that. Typically we try to just be pretty accommodating to what works well with them. As the client. I tend to be a little bit over accommodating. So I'm learning myself to like set some more boundaries with clients, or to be a little bit more, assertive and respectful, in a sense of like, okay, cool, here are the weeks that we recommend you do it, or here's kind of how we recommend this goes. But a lot of times it's, we get a show launched as soon as they're able, and then we just go bi-weekly from there. And I still don't know if bi-weekly is every other week or twice in a week or both. Because
semi-weekly, bi-weekly.
I'm not really sure.
Sorry. Yeah, bi-weekly, it would be every other week.
Okay.
So not twice a week, but once.
So what do I
every
say?
2 weeks.
What do I say if a show is doing twice per week?
Twice a week.
Yeah, I just avoid those terms altogether. I say twice a week or every 2 weeks.
Sorry.
There you go.
Because even
I
if
had
you
to
say
do
twice,
a biannual certification for a previous job, so that was kind of ingrained in my whole head there. So maybe that's just me. Anyway, wow. Beyond the frequencies, let's really get into the meat of this. Steve, help us out here.
So Seth has been measuring the success of different shows for many years. And I remember you did a presentation at Podcast Movement maybe it's 2023 or 2022 about analytics. And wow, how has things changed recently with the addition of Spotify and of course with people measuring YouTube. When you're measuring the analytics and you're doing this just like a podcast manager would, you're collecting the data and you want to report this to your client. What are the metrics that you're trying to evaluate from? What are you gathering?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think today, part of this conversation, we'll talk about what metrics matter and why do they matter in different things. And I think that's really the important piece of this. So we've been erring on the side of at least tracking almost everything in a sense, because it's like so fragmented. We kind of have wanted to make sure that we have a grasp at least on everything. That doesn't mean we're looking at every data point and making decisions off of every data point. But for most of our clients, we the logistics of this is we have a big old Google Sheet. We're one of the Google Sheet empires. And we're pulling data from their podcast host on a weekly basis at minimum, sometimes more frequently. We're pulling data from Apple Podcast Connect, from Spotify for podcasters or creators or whatever they're calling it this week. So we're pulling data initially from all of those places and then also YouTube. And the goal in that is to establish benchmarks. So to establish like what's the normal behavior that's happening, and then to be able to see if something different happens, whether it's positive or negative. The main metrics in there that we're interested in is going to be completion rate, like completion or retention, the percentage of people that are still engaging with an episode. And we can talk about that because I think that's one of the more qualitative. That's probably what I think is one of the most important ones, because that's one of the few metrics that gives us like a qualitative approach to how good is this episode. And then recently we've been working with Bumper, and we've been tracking listeners per week. And I really like that number of like looking at on a weekly basis, are there more humans listening to your show than there were last week? So that sometimes is in conjunction with downloads and that sometimes is in conflict with downloads. But that's been one thing that we've been starting to track more often is listeners per week, looking at retention of individual episodes to determine the quality. And then with some clients, this kind of gets like out. This is a little bit more unique in our world of like mostly we're hired by businesses. So the businesses or brands or, whatever size they are, they're looking to see the business and to see, is this generating interest in what we're doing? And so we've worked with Podscribe, which is one of the big attribution companies. And initially I've worked with them to build a custom attribution that we're kind of still working through the kinks, but that gives us the ability to like attach some JavaScript code to the client's website and then actually to know how many website visitors are coming from the podcast and how many, for one client, we're giving them website visitors and how many sales calls got booked from podcast listeners on a weekly basis. So that kind of gives like the broad scope. There's a lot of nuance in all of those things, but for us, that's what we're looking at on a weekly basis.
Yeah, you lost me at JavaScript. Maybe Mark knows about that.
I don't really know much about JavaScript either, but like if somebody's like, hey, copy and paste this here or tell your web person to do this, then I'm like, okay, cool. I can do that, but don't ask me too much.
And there's other ways to measure website visits, but there's a lot of things that you just said that I want to get into. Maybe we need to take a step back to make sure that when we're talking about, you said a couple things, how many listeners, we're talking about downloads, we're talking about analytics. Those are actually all three different measurement things. Shall we start with what is a download? How is it measured? And how is it measured in different, and we got to say downloads are plays. How's that defined within the three major platforms, Apple Podcasts and all the podcast apps, Spotify, and YouTube?
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's much more confusing than people realize.
Mm-hmm. Which is why we're doing it here on the show. We're going to explain it. This is it. Bottom line. This is the final word.
Yeah. And I will just say, like, I think it's important to understand these things because it's important that you as an editor or manager or producer of a show, that you know if your show is effective. I think a lot of people have hid behind ineffective shows for a long time because they haven't like actually known, is this working or is this not, particularly in like kind of the business world. So I think that's why all of this complicated stuff is important to understand, is because you want to be able to communicate to a client or to a show you're working on that, okay, this show is going in the right direction and here's how we know that. I think the first piece is going to be downloads. to my knowledge, the standard for what is considered a download is still 60 seconds of playtime. That is typically tracked by what percentage of an audio file is downloaded. So the way that I look at it is if you have a 60 minute episode, and that happens to be 60 megabytes. If 1 megabyte is downloaded of that episode, then I think that the system is initially like, okay, cool. That means at least 60% or 60 seconds, 1/60th of this was consumed. Kind of complicated, but initially I think, I might be wrong, but I think that's how those are being tracked. So that's the big picture understanding of downloads, and the IAB, which is like the certification group, says, it's got to be 60 seconds. So for pretty much the history of podcasting, that's been how most advertisements are sold. That's been how most shows are monetized, is initially how much is an advertiser going to pay to reach 1,000 downloads. The hard thing is when you log into Apple Podcast Connect, which is just like their backend analytics, you're actually not going to see the term downloads. You're going to see listeners, which is like pretty much anybody. I think, I can't even remember what it is. I think it's like anybody that listened for, I don't know, like 5 seconds or more or something.
Well, theirs has two measurement aspects to it. One is like 20% of the length of the episode, so a short one can still be counted even if it's less than the 1 minute of play.
Yeah, and that one's engaged listeners. So you'll see listeners, engaged listeners, and plays. Plays inside of Apple Podcasts is anytime somebody hits the play button. So if I'm listening to this episode next week and I'm listening to it and Mark calls me and you interrupt me from listening to it and my phone pauses the download or pauses the episode, and then after we talk, then I hit play again, that now counts as another play. So that's why oftentimes within Apple Podcasts, you see the plays are way overinflated, and you'll have more plays than you will downloads. So Apple is sending that data back to your podcast host, and the podcast host is figuring out how many downloads there are.
Is that useful? Because we can see downloads is like how many times a episode was downloaded and played more than 60 seconds. But then a play is how many times people engaged with the episode.
I don't think it's
3-hour show. Yeah.
I don't think it's as useful as retention. Like, I think when you have the like retention percentage, I think that dwarfs it like pretty significantly.
Yeah.
So
we'll
then
talk about retention later.
Yeah. And then in Spotify has now kind of gotten rid of, so they called download streams, which was also 60 seconds. They recently pretty much got rid of that. I'll explain that in a sec, and have shifted to plays. They say it's a proprietary calculation of how many people are playing. From talking around the industry and from looking at data, I think that it is initially every time somebody starts an episode without having like repeated exposure. So inside of Apple Podcasts, you have, if I start an episode and then I pause it and play it 5 times, that's going to count as 5 plays. I think in Spotify that would count as 1. So that's kind of what like people are like thinking that it is, but it definitely, from the data that I've seen, and I happened to export a bunch of data from Spotify the day they made that release. I exported it that morning and then that evening, and the new play feature was, the numbers were identical to what previously was starts, which is 0 seconds or more. So inside of Spotify right now, it's challenging to see the like 60-second download or like what was a stream. You can still get it if you export data out, or if your show is in Megaphone, which is like their enterprise level. This is all confusing, but this is why I think it's pretty much essential to look at podcast analytics in 3 buckets, which is your audio. So like any RSS distributed files, and then you have Spotify if you're doing video, and then you have YouTube. So I kind of think it's like 3 pillars, and I think people are getting really I think it's causing a lot of confusion right now because people are still trying to look at Spotify in the same way that we're looking at other podcasting apps, and the data is just different. How they're doing it is different. How things are being promoted are different, and so I think it's a little bit more work, but I think it's easier to look at that data as a separate pillar. So that's kind of like an overview of typically plays across platforms, whether it's Apple or Spotify or YouTube, is going to be some version of somebody hit play and listened for somewhere between 0 seconds and 60 seconds. A download is supposed to be 60 seconds, but also phones are auto downloading. So I've heard people say that they estimate anywhere between 30 and 45% of downloads never go listened to. I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, and she's like, I just opened Apple Podcasts the other day and realized that I have 500 episodes of Annie F. Downs' That Sounds Fun podcast on my phone, because she subscribed like 5 years ago. So that's a problem, because in many cases, advertisers have already bought those downloads that are never going to be listened to. So
and
that
our clients are assuming that those have been listened to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I think that I think there's a pretty important shift right now happening towards paying attention to listeners, paying attention to more qualitative data. This gets a little bit more complicated with monetization and ads and how do we have those conversations. But this is why I err on the side of tracking more than I think we need to track, and then looking for abnormalities, looking for, okay, what are the benchmarks? What's overperforming, what's underperforming, and then what does that tell us about the actual episode?
Now let's talk about analytics. We've got downloads and plays. What about analytics? Analytics is a much better measurement, although we can't get that for all the places where people consume our client shows.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this is why we kind of pull them into, like, we call them our own analytics dashboards inside of Google Sheets or Excel or whatever you might use. So that's why we're pulling those things in, and then we can kind of, with a little bit of knowledge in Google Sheets formulas, you can probably start to see some trends when things go green, and that's good. And we're usually we'll usually have like this month's download numbers. We don't pull it daily, but we do track daily downloads or plays for a lot of shows. And then we'll compare those to last month. So for example, I don't even know what date it is. It's the 8th of this month. So when we put data in yesterday, because Monday's data day for us, we could see, okay, 7 days into the month, we are up like 3% over 7 days into last month. And so that's something where we're kind of looking over like month over month growth. And so that's kind of more of what I would say is like analytics. Like, what does the actual data mean? You're pulling these numbers in, but then what does it mean? And then I mentioned earlier, we've been using Bumper's dashboard and testing that out. And they have some very beautiful charts that bring it all together.
For the podcast managers doing this themselves.
Yeah.
More of the analytics measurements is they're going to have to log into, and there's really only 3 places I think I can get good consumption analytics. That's really, I'm really driving this, is analytics is more about consumption rate, maybe listener subscriber count, stuff like that. Is Apple Podcasts, Spotify for creators, and you don't even have to host at Spotify. You just have to have the show listed there. And it doesn't have to be video. It can be the audio show. And YouTube, if you're having a podcast posted to YouTube. Because from there, you can see how many people have started, how many people have listened in, however far, where they dropped off. If they completed, it's going to give you a top level consumption rate of, you can look at the list of episodes and say, hey, 69% of the people made it. There's 69% consumption rate on this, and 75 that one must have been better. Because it's one thing to have a lot of downloads. And I'll tell you what, downloads are a lie. I've said this for a decade now. It's 2025. I said this for a decade. Downloads are a lie because people say, oh, my best episode was such and such because it got the most downloads. No, you had a really good title, caused people to hit play. How far in did they listen? You might have a show with a really bad title, but people stayed all the way through. That's a better episode than the one that got, 10,000 downloads because of clickbait. Would you disagree with that, or would you agree with that?
No, I would agree. And we've been trying to work on this, like, we've been trying to create I like formulas. So I like figuring out like, okay, is there a way that we could plug this data in and kind of see like, is there like a qualitative approach to being like, this show was good? Like, is there somebody that can give me like a 2 thumbs up, 1 thumbs up, or like 1 thumbs down, 2 thumbs down type thing? Because in one sense, if you get a lot of downloads, and this is actually where like the streaming data in Spotify was helpful, like knowing 60 seconds in. So now, unfortunately, you kind of have to like look at that manually. But for example, if you get a lot of plays, a lot of people that start the episode, but not a lot of people are listening 60 seconds in, then that means that you had a good title. Initially, you had good packaging for the episode, bad intro or bad episode. Like the first 60 seconds, maybe there was a mismatch. If you have low downloads, but high retention, then that means you probably had bad packaging for an episode, bad title, but the ones who actually listened to it were really good. If you have great, high number of downloads, high number of retention. And it's like, cool, good packaging, good episode. And then if you have low on both, then it's like bad packaging, bad episode. So you kind of have this like quadrant. Jeremy Inns and I have talked about this a bunch. And so I think there's like ways to look at that. I did just hear, I had a meeting with some people at Spotify a couple weeks ago, and I like seeing at these conferences you guys have been to with me, and that a bunch of us go to. I like going to like the Spotify sessions or YouTube, or, Apple never does them. They did one this year, but I like seeing what they officially say, because that those presentations are all like pre-approved by the marketing team. And so it's like, what are you allowed to say? And then in meetings, like what sometimes stuff comes out between the lines. And so one thing that came out kind of between the lines, not in a presentation, was that they're like featured spots inside of Spotify are being, a lot of those are handpicked, which I've known that. And I think a lot of people have known that they're picking shows to feature. And that's one way you can grow in Spotify, is if you're picked. But then there's other ones that the algorithm is picking. Like their Spotify algorithm is initially like selecting an episode and then suggesting it to people that might listen to similar content. And so I said, what's the metric that you guys are tracking that on? And they said that they are looking at retention 5 minutes into an episode. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that before. So like, I think that that's probably something that is important to look at, is how are your episodes performing 5 minutes in? And that's where you can see that inside of Apple by their Apple Podcast Connect, and inside of Spotify. But I think that's probably a pretty qualitative metric that then you can go into kind of, the analytics dashboards or whatever in Spotify and Apple, and look and see, okay, I want to be targeting 75% or whatever it is. I don't have a number today of what I think, because this is all new, but let's say it's 75%. I want to have 75% of my audience listening 5 minutes in. And if I have more than that, then there's maybe a chance that Spotify will give some additional organic promotion to my show. And I think that's interesting.
I know completion rate helps with rankings in Apple. You're telling me that 5 minutes is going to help with rankings on Spotify.
I wouldn't say rankings. I would say like
marketing, promotion.
But I don't might have to do with like chart rankings, but I've also heard from people at Spotify that they don't even trust their own charts.
And, it changes every week anyway. So who knows if it's going to be the same next week. Maybe it will be charts next week, And then there's YouTube, which is, the first 30 seconds is where, if you're going to get any help from YouTube on exposure and discovery, it's going to be, got to keep people at first 30 seconds. And that's where I see a lot of people see the play numbers, the play counts. But then when you go to your analytics and you see 50, 70% drop off after the first 30 to 45 seconds, I mean, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. I think all of this kind of leads to like why, I know we're going to talk later in the episode more of like, why does this matter? But it's like, if you're looking to get your show in front of more people, if your completion percentage is low, then that means people aren't finishing it. The chances of me recommending a show to my friends and family that I did not finish, that I only listen to 30% of, is virtually zero. So I think that as creators, we should be looking at this. We should be logging into the analytics platforms. We should probably be borderline obsessing over how do we increase the retention, and looking at if this episode was, only 65% instead of 75% 5 minutes in or 10 minutes in, or whatever point you pick to look at. Why? Was it, a new topic? Did we not introduce it very well? Was the person, whatever it might be, but just asking those questions why, I think, matters. Everybody's known for years that is what influences the YouTube algorithm. And so we know that. I think it also probably influences like the people algorithm, if you will, like what gets people to share shows. It's like probably a really good show that people want to listen to the whole thing of. And if you're getting, 85% retention on a, 45-minute episode, that's probably a sign that you did something well. So I think it's just important to kind of pay attention to that stuff.
Well, that recommendation by people is very difficult to measure, because you're only going to get the sneezers. I think it's what Seth Godin calls them, the people who tell others about it, where you might have somebody who's like, this is a really good episode, and they might mention it to somebody, but maybe their friends don't listen to or watch podcasts, or, it's really hard to measure that.
Yeah. Well,
I think Seth's point is to measure it. He's basically saying, and this has been true in business schools for decades, it's cheaper to retain current customers than it is to go out and attract and buy new customers. And if you treat our listeners as they are, paying with their attention, it's cheaper to retain the people that are already listening than doing all this marketing and things to get new listeners, because once a new listener hits your show, most of them bounce because it's not great quality. So it sounds like focus on the package of the quality and keep that engagement up. And then once that's at a good level, then you look at growing new audiences.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of people are focused on trying to grow the new audiences, and they're starting to experiment with paid advertising and all of this stuff when they're not looking at is their show good? As we've been doing more consulting lately, like I mentioned in the beginning, we've been entering into these conversations where people are like, we have a bunch of money to advertise the podcast. Like, that's the solution, right? And I'm like, not yet. Like, we have to figure out, is your podcast working? Because I like to use the analogy of a leaky bucket. Like, if you have a hole in the bottom of the bucket and then you put the hose in it, the hose will probably fill that bucket up, but it probably won't really be like overflowing because water is going to continually be falling out. So you might have the illusion that your bucket is full. I think a lot of the podcasts that we see on the top charts are doing this. They're continually doing paid advertising. They're getting some organic exposure from that paid advertising as well, and just chart placement and different things. But if the show isn't good enough that your audience isn't sharing it, that it like pretty much if your show isn't good enough that it's growing on its own, then I think that paid advertising is just going to be wasting a bunch of money. And it's like if you're starting a business and you go and ask your mom, it's like the mom or grandma test. Like if you tell your grandma your business idea, she's probably going to say that's amazing. If she thinks it's terrible, then that's a problem. Like you're probably gonna
That's
have a
good
really,
advice then.
yeah, you're probably gonna have a really hard time like getting strangers to like your idea. Now usually people that are so close to us, they're gonna give us, kind of rose-colored advice, and they'll probably say it's better than it actually is. And that's a factor too. But if your show's not growing on its own, then I don't really think it makes sense to be spending paid advertising dollars.
And it sounds like that is indicative to a lot of things that the three of us have seen, and many of the people that are watching or listening to this episode have probably seen in the other podcasting groups that aren't focused on editing and production. A lot of the podcasting groups that are just, hey, I dropped a new episode, or share my new episode, or hey, it's sharing Monday, Tuesday, whatever day, post your episode link below. Those are people that are just looking at that one download metric and think, hey, as you said, let's put more water in the top of that bucket. Let's not even look at how many holes are in there that if people are listening through. Let's promote. And instead of like spending the ads, they're doing it through, their time and effort on social media. And just like the grandma analogy of the echo chamber, sometimes you have a lot of that with, some entry level podcasters, or maybe just not business focused podcasters, where they're doing those types of promotion, or they're doing review swaps and things like that, which, I like a review for a good show, not so much because, hey, let's swap it and help each other out. I think the systems and the platforms are too smart for that now. That may have worked, well over a decade ago, but now they're looking at, as we all said here, completion rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one other thing that is interesting with this is I think if your show does start growing, you need to expect your analytics to change. So we see this often in the YouTube world, where people kind of obsess over the click-through rate of a thumbnail. But the way that a YouTube video goes viral is you publish a YouTube video, YouTube generally shows that to people in your first tier audience, whether they're subscribers or people that have watched your stuff. So they're going to be, they're probably going to be in that like grandma test level of familiarity. And if they like it, if they click on the thumbnail, often like at a high rate, and if they complete a high rate, then YouTube will show it to more strangers. Naturally, strangers are going to listen to less of your consume less of a percentage and click on less of it because they don't know who you are. So I think there's also a lot of conversation where people are obsessing over these metrics, but then when your show gets pumped in front of new people, then they're confused as to why your retention drops. And it's the same reason why, if I was giving this talk, if we were talking about this to people that were not podcasters and not podcast editors, then the completion rate would be lower. So I think people need to also, we need to recognize that if we are seeking to grow our show, once your show begins to grow, or if you get a feature on Spotify or something like that, don't panic when your download or your completion rates look very different and be like, oh my gosh, there's only 30%. But if inside of Spotify, you're seeing, man, there was an extra 200% people that saw this, then okay, that's great. So, but it's kind of like a double-edged sword a little bit. And I think a lot of people are like, what's going on? What's wrong? It's like, this is normal. This is normal behavior if your show is getting in front of new people.
Seth, let me ask you this question, and I'm going to have you give us some of your secrets. So we get these analytics, we measure the downloads, we're looking at the impressions, all this stuff. Once we have this data and we present it to our clients, so what do we do next? What are some of the applicable things, some of the things you can actually put into place? We all say, hey, make your content better. How do you do that? What are some of the things that you would tell clients once you looked at the analytics, how to improve the exposure or the completion rate, or just make the show sound better?
Yeah. I think one of the easiest ways to execute changing things is to begin to experiment with how you start episodes, just because it's fairly easy to look at how many people are listening 30 seconds in, 60 seconds in, 90 seconds in. I don't necessarily think you need all of those data points all throughout the episode, but especially because on some platforms, a download is still going to be tracked as 60 seconds or a stream or whatnot. Like there's still some significance to that 60-second mark. And now we're learning there might be significance to 5 minutes. And there's kind of these thresholds. I think that one of the ways of looking at that is, how are we starting episodes? Do we have a automatic third-party voiceover podcast intro that's playing right away? If so, then like, I think that was like really popular 5 years ago. I think that now it's like, from what I'm seeing, I think it's a little bit better retention wise to start the episode and say, hey, welcome back. Here is what we're going to talk about today. You're in the right place if you're this kind of person, because a lot of people are not creating their content for new people. Like they're not expecting new listeners to come. And so then new people come in and it's a confusing experience. So I think that's one piece, is looking at the first like 30 seconds to 90 seconds and making sure that is a welcoming experience for people that are familiar with who you are, and also that it's a clear experience for people that don't know you. We like to tell our clients, we want to make it as easy as possible for a new person to listen to the first 60 seconds of your show and say, I'm in the right place or I'm not in the right place. And if they're not in the right place, you don't want them there. They're going to mess with your analytics. So just get rid of them. So I think that is something that we focus on a lot, is the first like 60 to 90 seconds. That's something when I'm listening to a new show, I will often pay attention to how long does it take to actually get into something valuable. And you would be shocked. Oftentimes it's like 3 to 5 minutes or something like that. So I think that's something to think through. I also think it gives, looking at the analytics it gives you a better baseline to be able to test like different formats or different cadences of frequency or something. And an example of this is we had a client that was publishing daily, which I would not recommend for most people, unless you have a lot of time and a lot of money and not much else to do. And it was kind of burning this client out. And they'd been doing it for a long time. They were doing a good amount of downloads, around 100,000 downloads a month. They really did not want to drop below 100,000 downloads a month. Like it was a big ego thing, and they even admitted it to us. They were like, I can't handle not getting 100,000 downloads a month now that I've gotten above here. And so we were beginning to feel like his content was taking a toll quality wise, because he was rushing the episodes and didn't seem as bought in. And so we said, we want to experiment going to 3 episodes a week. And I said, my assumption, I don't know if this is true, or my hypothesis that I want to look at is, will your listeners change? So your downloads will drop. I said, your downloads will guaranteed, they will drop probably to like 55 to 65,000 downloads a month. So I said, those will drop. But is that okay if your listeners either stay the same or grow, or even if they shrunk a little bit? Like if your listeners shrunk by 10%, but you only had to create 3 episodes a week instead of 5, is that a worthwhile trade? And it was actually an interesting situation, because our consulting agreement changed with that, or it like came to an end. They didn't want to take the advice, but I still had access to their analytics. And so then after our consulting agreement ended, they did make that change, and I was able to see all of the analytics, and their listeners stayed the same for a week and then began to grow. So their listeners were actually more engaged with the content. And the other thing was like their listen time. So the amount of time they were spending with the show skyrocketed because they were like, well, I can listen to more of 3 episodes than a small portion of 5. So it was this really interesting thing where looking at the analytics gave us the ability where we said, we don't know if this is going to work, but we think this is worth trying. And so I think that looking at the analytics gives us more insight into being able to test things out. I think formats are becoming less important in podcasting. Like, I don't think that every show needs to have the same format. And so I think that you can test stuff like that and then look at the data and say, did this work? Did this not work? Okay, cool. That was a terrible idea. Let's go back. Or, oh, this was a really good idea. Now we don't actually have to produce 5 episodes a week and we can still get the same bang for our buck. So those are some things that we like to look at.
You were talking about how they were the audience may not listen all the way through because they had so much content, and that's just making me think about the fire hose. I might need a drink, but I don't need to be drinking from a fire hose. But if you turn down the water pressure and it's just coming out slowly, I'm going to be able to have more of that water than what's coming out if they got it full blast. And it's a shame because
it's all a resource, right? Yeah. It's about, do you put more of that resource on the top, whether it's advertising money or social media, throwing out their money at the top, or do you spend the resource on shoring up the bucket? So it's all about resource allocation. And this has got me thinking about the banter at the beginning of this particular episode. Did we have a little bit too much off-topic banter before we really jumped in? Are we missing out? Are we going to lose people before we?
And that's a good question to ask. And so that's why it's like there's not any right or wrong formula. It's just, are you asking the questions as a creator? Are you looking at the content and saying, is this like, are we maximizing this or are we not? And I think it's just iterating along the way is the important thing.
So I guess I'm going to leave all that banter in at the beginning and find out, because I was thinking cutting it out earlier.
Well, and that's where I like to, I'll say with that, like, I think banter can be good, but I think that you need to like hook them before. So I think in a situation like that, if we were working with a show and they were, they enjoyed having 3 to 5 minutes of banter, then it's like, in a conversation like this, I would probably recommend saying something like, hey, we're really glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about X, Y, and Z. And that might sound like analytics might sound really boring, but it's actually important because we want to help you be better at communicating the value of your podcast to your clients so that they keep hiring you forever. And then you're like, okay, Mark, what's the weather?
Yeah.
So I think then they're like,
in fact, what's going to happen, Seth, is Steve is going to use that and he's going to throw that in the very beginning. And then we're going to do our little banter thing. And then people are listening what's going on. And then once they've reached this part of the episode, they realize, oh, they organically did that. And it worked because I'm here listening. And you know what? If it didn't work, they're not here listening anyway. So it's kind of a, observational bias thing.
But then if I put it at the beginning and they drop off, I mean, then they'll never get to the end to find out that this was a test.
Right. That's what I'm saying. But you never get that data. Yeah. It's, how do you prove a false positive? So, Seth, not a lot of people know this about me, but I used to run a data analytic group at a large company. I don't know if I could say the name, but the initials were GE. We'll keep that quiet. So I did that for well over a decade. As Steve knows, I'm a math guy. I'm a reformed data scientist. So I love metrics. I love quantifying everything. In fact, for many years, we ran the podcast editor survey, and a couple of the key questions we asked early on was, how much we gave a particular work scope, and then we'd say, how much would you charge for this? And how much time would you spend on it? It's much like, what are the downloads and what's your completion rate? And then we use a formula, a very, very complicated division formula to come up with the rate. And really, because we wanted to use that as a predictive model. And it sounds like if there was some type of key metric or something, whether it may be, listens time, completion rate, percentage or whatever. So if, as your point earlier, if you're at 85% completion and you drop down to 30% completion, but because your listens and downloads went up like 200 fold or whatever, then overall you're good, even though that one metric went down. But then, we would look at other things and quantify those things and try to get the math to predict itself so we could then help other people drive that number. It sounds like maybe you do somewhat of the same for businesses. So let me ask this. That was a long-winded way of jumping in and saying, these businesses that you're working with, do they really care? And if so, what are they doing with that information?
Some of them care. I will say, like, we haven't focused a ton up to this point on the advertising side of podcasts. We've kind of been experimenting with a couple shows over the last year, but I've heard from other agencies that are working with like bigger, like maybe Fortune 1000 companies or something, where they're like CMO or whoever's running the podcast project, they'll have these kind of arbitrary metrics where their boss and their boss's boss wants to see that the podcast is doing at least 100,000 downloads a month because they've decided that that means it's significant. And so then, maybe organically it gets to 20,000 downloads a month, or maybe it gets to 5. And then they're, calling these advertisers with the budget and saying, hey, can you get us an extra 85,000 downloads a month in the next 20 days so that we can hit our metrics? That stuff happens all the time.
Okay.
So
That's
I do think that like in the business world, sometimes there are arbitrary metrics that are picked and they're said, we don't want to be doing this unless it's hitting this number of downloads a month.
And you mentioned earlier that you're measuring a lot of these metrics once per week. Are you giving the metrics to your clients once per week, or are you distilling that down to like a monthly or a quarterly report? And if so, does that, I guess, measure frequency really impact their actions? Are they going to act differently if you give them the report like once a month versus once a week? Or
so we've been experimenting with this and kind of going back and forth. Typically, we've done monthly reports. We're starting to up the reporting and kind of err on the side of giving our clients too much information so that it's there if they want to dig into it. For our like what I would say like our highest level clients are kind of the clients that we're like most involved in, we're giving them weekly reports. And so we're going to be giving them weekly reports on certain data. We're going to be highlighting what episodes are overperforming or underperforming from like a playback or downloads or plays, however you want to call it. I do really like the like 7-day download number. And so that's something that we're looking at. Like, I think we need to have like a set time, like your good episodes in your back library, they're going to continue to grow in downloads. So at some point we have to say, okay, we're comparing 7 days in from all of these episodes to be able to know. But yeah, I think that the businesses I think that they do care. I think that it's just nobody's known how to really quantify it in a valuable way for businesses. And so I think that's why we've seen a lot of turnover in business podcasts, is because they start a podcast and they spend a lot of money and then it's getting 200 downloads a month and they don't really know if that matters. So we've tried to help our clients position their show in more of like a middle of funnel realm. So a red flag for me is if I get a call from a business owner and they're like, we're really excited to start a podcast and get a bunch of new customers. Like, okay, this is a red flag. And I'll usually tell them, like, if you need customers fast, then like go spend money on Facebook and Google. If you want a tool that's going to like engage, like more of a community engagement and nurturing tool over the next few years, then a podcast is perfect for it. So we advise our clients to be looking at when people are purchasing from you, ask them about the podcast, ask them if they're listening. And oftentimes it's like, oh yeah, I've been listening for 6 months. They never told you that. They never commented. They never rose their hand and said, I'm a listener, but they listened and they trusted you more. And so we're starting to try to quantify more of those conversations. And that's why we're integrating kind of the website traffic so that we can at least begin to see, here's how many people are coming to your website, different things like that. But mostly from our perspective, I think that a podcast serves businesses best when it's positioned as like a middle of funnel, more marketing tool rather than an advertising tool. And I think that that is the best, that lends to the best content for the audience. And I also think that that is harder to track the success, the ROI of, but I think that in the long run, it's a lot more successful for businesses.
I've heard the same thing. It's not such a powerful tool for lead awareness or making new customers aware of you, but certainly for lead nurturing, for that customer nurturing relationship there, especially for mid to higher ticket items. Maybe people aren't listening to a podcast to wonder which gas station they're going to. Do they go to this one or that one across the street? More commodity things. But when they're thinking about working with a particular real estate agent or lawyer or something, or CPA, and one has a podcast, they'll start to educate themselves and then realize, wow, this person has kind of talked me into working with them while under the guise of helping me out with information.
Yeah. And like we're shopping for a new CPA right now. And I just had a conversation with somebody, and I guarantee you that if after our conversation, if within 24 hours, if I would have gotten a message from him and just said, hey, really enjoyed Really enjoyed talking with you. Here's our top 3 podcast episodes. Guaranteed I would have listened to them. Just because I'm like trying to figure out, like, how do I feel about this guy? Do I like this guy? We had a quick 20-minute call, but that doesn't feel like enough to, decide if they're my CPA or not. So I think like those are the situations where we see podcasting working really, really well for businesses.
Definitely. Yeah, I've heard something similar with service professionals that have a podcast.
Yeah. But it takes patience. Like that's definitely the long game. And that's where I think it's really challenging is the first few podcasts that we produced for people. This was 5-6 years ago. It was very much like, we're going to help grow your business. Like that was the positioning was there. We're going to help grow your business. Podcasting is cool. Podcasting is popular. You're going to get social media content, all of this stuff. And so, hire us and we'll help grow your business. And I think the first podcast that I edited, I did it for $30 an episode. And I even forgot to invoice them. And then I was like, why haven't they been paying me? And it's like, oh, I forgot to start the subscription for them.
Right.
And then it was like, oh man, I feel too guilty to like go back pay. So I'm like, I'll just eat it, like whatever it was.
Yeah.
But it was very much like, oh, this will grow your business. I didn't really realize that if your business isn't growing without the podcast, then the podcast probably is not like, it's not going to save it. Like a really good podcast doesn't fix a bad business. And that took us, unfortunately, producing good podcasts for businesses that didn't quite know their identity yet. They didn't have like a sales process. They didn't know what their product was, but they were hoping that like podcasting, like, oh, cool, we'll start a podcast, it'll go viral, and then we'll figure it out. And I think that's a really bad strategy.
And you'll see that strategy or lack of strategy, or maybe more faith than strategy in other places, especially going back to podcasting, those that will do podcast sponsorships versus those that do an affiliate type thing for a podcast. I'm like, hey, I don't know if you can convert if I send you this traffic, and if you don't convert, I don't get anything. So how about you show me that you can convert well by paying for a sponsorship, and then it's on you to convert when we do this traffic to you.
Mm-hmm.
So one last question. I want to go back, and this is kind of where you were leading to, Seth, a few minutes ago about giving the numbers, the reports, the analytics to your clients, and some you send monthly, some weekly. You mentioned you really like that 7-day metric. Do you get either qualitative feedback from them, like, hey, this is great, I think we'll try this or we'll try that? Or do you not hear anything back, but you can see quantitatively in the next data report that they're doing something different, that they're trying something out, that maybe something has changed?
Think you already answered that story with the guy who took his advice after he fired him.
Yeah, that was funny.
Go down from 5 to 3 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is like the best clients take the advice, and they're willing to experiment and test it and different things like that. Clients that are not, they're just wanting to produce podcasts and do the same thing every week. I think it's going to become more and more difficult to be successful with that kind of a perspective. And I think that's hopefully what creators are realizing. Similarly, positioning wise, as saying how we used to position our podcasts, like this will help grow your business. I also remember telling some business owners, like, give me 30 minutes of your week and we can produce a great podcast for you. And now we're kind of saying like the opposite. Like, I don't know what the number is, but you will get out of this what you put into it. And so we've joked at times and been like, maybe we should just put on our podcast, on our website, like, takes longer than you think, takes more time than you think on a weekly basis, costs more than you think, and is harder than you think. Sound interesting? Like, call us.
It's like that's kind of
it's
like road work.
It's kind of the reality. And I think that for a few years in podcasting, there was a lot of service agencies. We were part of the problem for a while. That was kind of saying like, oh, you can do this as fast as possible. I do think podcasting is very efficient, and it's one of the most efficient marketing tools that a business can do. However, to really be successful, I think we're getting to the place in the industry where you have to be willing to experiment. You have to be willing to like have some feedback loops. And with that, I'll say, I think one of the biggest problems that keep podcasts bad and crappy is our feedback loops are so long in podcasting. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever thought about this with like the math, but like, let's say one of our clients is like batch recording episodes, and they record 4 to 6 episodes over like 2 days. And let's say that in an ideal world, we're working a month ahead. from an editing perspective. So that sixth episode isn't going live. Like if we recorded that today, that sixth episode isn't going live for 10 weeks. Then if you're doing a monthly analytics report, then let's say that that was the first week of the month, and then you didn't pull that analytics for until the next month. So then it's like, okay, now we're at 14 weeks out. Then you give the feedback to the client. Maybe they take it. Let's assume that they do, that they're a good client. They're not recording for another 3 weeks. So now we're at 17 weeks. And then you have to track whether or not that's working by looking at the data to see, did this recommendation make sense? And so we're looking at about 5 months from like thinking about planning an episode, recording an episode, getting it batched. Now, not everybody's that planned out, but I think that's kind of one of the problems in podcasting is like the iterations, it's months and months and months. And so we've been trying to figure that out of like, what are ways that we can keep the feedback cycles quicker? And so we don't advise clients to really almost ever be more than like 3 to 5 weeks out with episodes, because we've seen somewhere they're like, great, we record 6 months of content. And I'm like, great, what if we publish the first one and then the audience says this sucks? Like, you're kind of stuck. So with the feedback, we're trying to figure out and get creative with ways that we can shorten that.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for joining us on Podcast Editor Mastermind. I really appreciate, you don't know how much I appreciate the discussion of analytics. Sometimes I feel like I focus on numbers way too much. At least that's the feedback I get from a lot of people. And that's where I've learned things of such as, the metric frequency and cost of curiosity and things like that. But I do appreciate talking to you about what metrics are important and what they mean, especially understanding is it a good episode or is it being promoted well? Is it the package, the wrapper? I think you mentioned that. I really enjoyed that. So thank you. Steve, do you have anything to add?
No, I just appreciate everything. He confirmed a lot of things that I believed and gave me some insights that I can use with my clients. So I appreciate you, Seth. You can find Seth at storyon.co. Thanks for being on the show, Seth.
Absolutely. Thanks to both of you. And yeah, happy to be a resource for anybody who wants to reach out with any further questions.